thank everyone for coming out on a beautiful Colorado afternoon, isn't it? One of the things that just struck me as we were talking just before things started, Cheryl was talking to Anne, who was one of Cheryl's mentors at Ohio State. And just a couple of hours earlier, Cheryl was talking to Jennifer Novak, who was one of Cheryl's students at Penn State. And, you know, whenever I see, I'm a sucker for those academic generation kinds of things.
Does that make me correct?
Yeah.
Well, she's your grand student. She's your grand student, yeah.
A couple of years ago, Cheryl, Glenn, and I were attending a small meeting in Charleston, South Carolina. We had some free time and the group scattered for some touristing. Cheryl came back that evening to report that she'd unexpectedly met an old high school classmate from growing up in a small Ohio town. His name was Jimmy. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Jimmy had fallen on some harder times, and here he was knocking out about the South. As Cheryl told this story of meeting him, she remembered more about growing up in a town with clothesline and rhubarb patches in the towns. I think of that when I see Cheryl here today and watch her interact with my colleagues in the writing program. Got to spend part of the afternoon together. She embodies both a wonder for the past and a wonder for its people, not as nostalgia for the bygone, but as interest in the what was and what it might yet more fully be. Cheryl Glenn is currently Professor of English and Women's Studies and co-director of the Center for Democratic Studies at Penn State. And these professional titles well represent her scholarly output. She's author of at least 5 very important books, including Unspoken, A Rhetoric of Silence, and Rhetoric Retold, Regendering the Tradition from Antiquity through the Renaissance. She's written significant textbooks and has won major awards, both for her teaching and for her scholarship. Cheryl's also been a leader in the Modern Language Association divisions and as president of the Coalition of Women Scholars in the History of Rhetoric and Composition. In fact, she still is a leader, currently working her way to being chair of the Conference on College Composition and Communication, the nation's oldest and largest, and to my opinion, most important professional association of college and university writing and rhetoric scholars. All that you can read in a CV. What comes through from the person and her words, however, is an extraordinary sense of caring. It's grounded in deep respect for the past, a sense of its trajectories and potentials, both realized and missed. She cares about people, whether she's trying to understand and render them as a scholar, or whether she's trying to help them make their way through schooling or professional life. She's one of the smartest people I know, and one of the most deeply ethical about her being in the discipline. And we're lucky to have her here today talking about feminist engagements with rhetoric, the possibilities.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I'm really thrilled to be here. So nice to be with my good and trusted friend, Doug, to see Margaret again. I haven't seen her for a while. To see Anne doing so well. Of course, that's no surprise. When she was my teacher of the hardest course, in one 10-week period, we did Burke and Booth. And she did it. She got us through that. And of course, she'd be chair of your department, and I'm so glad you're here on this beautiful campus. It's really great. I'm using your invitation to talk about my work in rhetoric and my commitment to representation and inclusivity in rhetorical studies. As a feminist historiographer, I've spent a good deal of my career emphasizing the contributions of women to the rhetorical tradition. Do I need this?
Yes.
And see, I think I'm...
That's just for the video.
You haven't heard a word?
No, we've heard it, but we need the mic. Thanks.
Can you hear it now?
Yeah.
It's like Verizon. Okay. As a feminist historiographer, I've spent a good deal of my career emphasizing the contributions of women to the rhetorical tradition. But like the feminist project itself, my research agenda has moved beyond the primary work of recovering women. Over the years, I've become interested in seeking out the rhetorical power of others and rhetorical displays that are delivered in other ways. This trajectory is the subject of my remarks this afternoon: feminist engagements with rhetoric, the possibilities. And one thing I'm hoping is that the word feminist won't turn anybody off. I guess you already had a warning, but as Dorothy Allison told us at 4Cs last year, many, many more young women will come out and say they're lesbian and they don't want to be feminist. You know, it's easier to be lesbian than feminist. Maybe. I don't know where I was going with that. I'll open, except to quote Dorothy Allison, I'll open by discussing Rhetoric Retold, which realized the possibility of locating women's contributions to and participation within the rhetorical tradition. Then I'll move quickly to the second possibility, Unspoken, which joins the feminist historiographic project by reinscribing the rhetorical tradition to include the purposeful delivery of silence. My current project, to which I hope soon to return, especially, after I rotate through the chair's work of the 4Cs, is how the Mormons became Indian. It represents the third possibility, a link between rhetoric and identity studies. I'll close by speaking to the ways that these projects can help transform rhetorical studies. To cover these possibilities, I've truncated my research and elided my theoretical moves, and as you'll see, crossed out lots of lines. So there will be some gaps, and I'd be happy to talk about that later. I've broken my talk into 6 sections, as you can see with the handout. Part 1, Engendering Humanity. Throughout my remarks, I'll use gender as an analytic category rather than a biological one. As a primary way of signifying relations of power, gender signifies the inequities and hierarchies learned through and perpetuated by culture. Those terms of identity that historically have determined the rhetorical issues of who controls the discourse, who is included and excluded from forums of discussion and decision-making, and most important, who gets to decide. Already we're to part 2. Where are the women? That's a decoy. The other parts aren't so short. Rhetoric always inscribes the relation of language and power at a particular moment, indicating who may speak or who may or must remain silent, who may listen, who is listened to, and what can be said or what must remain unspoken. Every one of us, male and female, knows how rhetoric works. We gauge the situation, our audience, our social rank. If we think someone will listen to us, in other words, if we have an audience, we move our language or our silence forward as appropriately as we can toward our intended goal. Sometimes we're successful. Other times, we rethink how we should have proceeded, given our purpose, our audience, our rank. Yet, despite our inherent rhetorical know-how and any formal training, rhetorical training we may have, neither of which is genetically linked to the Y chromosome, rhetorical history, for the most part, has remained the domain of public, political, aristocratic males, with little mention given to all the others who have practiced persuasive discourse all along. Now, my work remains rooted in the belief that surely some others, women, the ignored, the discounted, those who have been gendered, invisible, and silent, could legitimately be seen as creative participants in Western intellectual life and could be the proper objects of scholarly inquiry. So in a move that can be defined as strategic positivism, to echo Spivak, I began the research necessary for writing a history of rhetoric inclusive of women. A regendered rhetoric, if you will. Although I was pointing to a different set of subjects, women, for historical inquiry, and admitting the interestedness of my scholarly project, I couldn't completely abandon the fact of a male-only rhetorical tradition until I had responsibly accumulated enough evidence through historically deep and wide research to support a new fact. women had indeed participated in the rhetorical tradition. Then I've cut out a paragraph on what facts are. The reception of my early work was met with some excitement, but there was also a measure of disbelief. To wit, when I first argued that Aspasia had taught Pericles how to deliver persuasive speeches in 5th century BCE Athens, I was reminded that I hadn't found any of her primary texts, so she couldn't be a rhetorician. That we've never had any of Socrates' primary text seemed to be beside the point. When I wrote about Hortensia's successful argument before the Roman triumvirs in 42 BCE, which resulted in the reduction of taxes women were to submit, I was told that Hortensia could not be a rhetor because she'd spoken publicly, politically, and persuasively, but only once. So I wondered, how many speeches of Patrick Henry have we ever studied? When I described the rhetorical power of Marjorie Kemp's 14th century autobiography, the earliest extant autobiography written in English, I was told that she composed it when she was suffering from postpartum depression, was crazy, you'll remember some of these comments, you didn't make them, and therefore could not be a rhetorician. Now, being crazy and being a rhetorician were mutually exclusive categories for Kemp, but not for Nietzsche. And when I described the powerful public manipulation of England's Queen Elizabeth the First, I call her QE1. Queen Elizabeth I, I was reminded that her rhetorical display could not count because she was queen, which makes me wonder, what does that say about our president? That last admonition should have been my biggest hint of what I was up against. Those unwilling to rethink the already received rhetorical tradition had decided long ago that it was a male-only tradition of mastery and dominance. Their thinking operated according to the formula of X+1. Whenever a woman has accomplished the same goals as her male counterpart, theorizing, public speaking, successful argument, persuasive prose, the stakes instantly rise. She may have achieved X, but she needs X+1 to earn a place in rhetorical history. It wasn't until I rethought the grammar of rhetoric, redefining each of its basic terms, that I was able to answer my mostly well-meaning critics and write Women into a History of Rhetoric. If self-conscious, persuasive language use, in other words, rhetoric, could circulate in the private sphere as well as the public sphere, then women could be rhetors. If collaboration, invitation, and dialogue could be considered persuasive techniques, then women could be rhetoricians. And most important, if X could be stabilized, then many female voices could responsibly be written into the tradition on the same grounds that men had been. Women could be moved from positions of silence and invisibility to positions of rhetorical voice and presence. One of the most satisfying endeavors in that project was writing Aspasia of Miletus into the tradition. When Athenian-born citizen-class women were systematically relegated to the domestic sphere, the foreign-born Aspasia somehow became conscious of civil rights and responsibilities and distinguished herself in the public domain. Her reputation as both a rhetorician and philosopher was memorialized by Plato, Xenophon, Cicero, Plutarch, Athenaeus. For instance, Plato's Menexenus reveals Aspasia to be Socrates as well as Pericles' teacher of rhetoric, and also the speechwriter for the funeral oration, which Pericles delivered to great acclaim. Not limited by the restrictions of Athenian-born women, Aspasia moved across gendered boundaries of appropriate behavior, exploited her excursion into the masculine domain of politics and intellect, and left firmly situated contributions to rhetoric, even though they were later accorded to Pericles. Many women besides Aspasia have trespassed into rhetorical territory, leaving behind practices that can be recuperated as rhetorical if we take the time to reread primary and secondary sources, listening for traces of women's long silenced voices. Part 3. I think I hear something. At every turn of Rhetoric Retold, I face the central problem of the collective feminist project, silence and silencing. Much of the past is, of course, irrevocably silenced. Gestures, conversations, and original manuscripts can never be recaptured. Silence and silencing still greet us in every library, every archive, every text, every newscast. Yet my work on Rhetoric Retold gave me an appreciation for the paradoxical rhetorical properties of silence, its powers and its limitations. The rhetorical display of Anne Askew is a case in point. In 1546, the aristocratic Englishwoman was arrested on grounds of radical Protestantism, publicly interrogated, brutally tortured, judged by a jury, and then, for a climax, burned at the stake. Yet through it all, Askew refused to reveal any concealed information about her sect, let alone name the other members of that sect. She spoke only of her Protestant faith and of her extraordinary mastery of Scripture. Even under torture, Askew delivered silence rather than disclosure. God has given me the gift of knowledge, but not of utterance. And Solomon says that a woman of few words is a gift of God, Proverbs 19. For more of this story, you can see John Fox's Acts and Monuments or the Book of Martyrs. It's really a pretty good read. Askew's delivery harkens to silence as an understood rhetorical strategy. Silence has been gendered feminine, as a trope for oppression, passivity, emptiness, stupidity, or obedience. On the other hand, speaking out has been the signal of liberation, masculinity, especially given the Western tendency to overvalue the spoken word, except, of course, in the case of the powerful, tight-lipped U.S. hero embodied by Edward Norton, if you've seen The Painted Veil, Clint Eastwood, Tommy Lee Jones. Yet, despite these cultural codes, I began to imagine silence as a rhetoric, as a constellation of symbolic strategies that, like spoken language, serves many functions, and I began to work on unspoken. Part 4, Silence and Silencing. Like most scholarship in rhetoric, unspoken relies on traditional library and archival research. But it also includes the results of 2 naturalistic studies. I am limiting my remarks this afternoon to one of those studies, to the interviews I conducted with academics in the hope that their examples might resonate with your own academic experiences. And as I was cutting out today, I realized that I cut out some of the positive uses of silence. There are some, but there aren't any left in this manuscript. We can talk about that. The interviews I'll use today illustrate the power of silence and the powerlessness of being silenced. 2 differently gendered rhetorical positions. One a tactical choice, one a forced position, both carrying meaning. After all, silence is not in itself necessarily a sign of powerlessness or emptiness. It is not the same as absence, and silencing is not the same as erasing. Like the 0 in mathematics, silence is an absence with a function. The power of silence. Although silence is most often considered in gendered terms of subordination in the face of dominance, silence can also enact control. The dominant party wields silence to get our attention, to sustain it, to cut us off, to cut us out. Richard Watts writes that interturn silences, particularly those of more than 1.7 seconds duration, he's talking about conversational turn-taking, and you will remember my speaking earlier, my husband's long pauses between sentences. So silences of more than 1.7 seconds duration contribute in significant ways to the acquisition or loss of discourse status. For instance, if you're called into your dean's office, she may unconsciously sustain her silence beyond 1.7 seconds, enhancing the status she already holds. Is your dean here? No. Good. Well, it doesn't matter. It works. or she may want to know this. Other authority figures and peers as well, however, can exert silence as control consciously. When one faculty member uses silence with another, that received silence can be puzzling, insulting, even threatening. In the functions of silence, Richard Johannesson enumerates 20 functions for silence. Those functions range from carefully pondering what to say next and lacking sufficient information to talk on a topic to being the mark of sulking anger or a means to annihilate others symbolically by excluding them from verbal communication. Whatever the reason, and Johannesson writes that a person cannot not communicate. Whether silence is conscious or unconscious, the effect is the same. Like a Foucauldian character within the spectacle of punishment, the receiver of silence feels slighted, maybe even threatened and tortured, and usually angry. A well-established white professor, and these academics are not all in English studies, but this one is. Formerly of a large urban university, told me about the silent treatment he received there, which he suspected arose out of the subdisciplinary turf battles within his department. This is the interview. The de facto leader of the theorists opposed all hires in composition, and mine in particular. I remember trying to start a couple of conversations with him when I first arrived and being more or less politely rebuffed. Then 2 or 3 years into my job there, he and I had an open disagreement during a search committee meeting about a candidate for a job in composition, during which I thought he was pretty high-handed. I went to his office the next day and told him so, and he told me he thought the entire field of composition was a fraud. After that conversation, he never spoke to me again, at least not outside the context of a public department meeting. What made this particularly odd was that we often rode the elevator together. I'd say, "Hi, John," or "Good morning, John," and he'd stare through me like I wasn't there. This, whether there were other people in the elevator or not. In fact, he'd sometimes talk to another person who stepped into the elevator with me while acting as though I wasn't there. While I'd like to say this didn't bother me, and while I can say I never gave up on greeting him whenever we met, I have to admit that his silence began to take a psychic toll. I can remember, for instance, coming into the building, seeing him in the elevator and thinking, maybe I should just take the stairs. But I didn't allow myself to do so. Instead, I'd walk up and say, "Hello, John," only to play through the same non-script once again. Now, what's interesting is so many people who'd received silence like this left that job, whatever field they were in, and they always got a better job. They went to another place, and I have several of those. Having since moved on to another university, this white male professor wrote to assure me, he started thinking, that despite those intermittent silences, his life in that department was, for the most part, very good, but that my asking about the uses of silence in the professional sphere made him, and this is a quote, realize that much of the strain of working there came from the ways hierarchies were policed silently and almost continuously. His experience thus works to demonstrate how silence can be used strategically, as it did by the person who delivered it. And without the kind, this is the best part, without the kind of spoken, one-on-one confrontation that can be witnessed by others or regretted later. When willfully employed, silence as a mode of communication can be powerful, especially when the profound human need to communicate with words, particularly among folks like us, is not met. However, language itself can yield silence by imposing silence on someone else or suggesting silence as the safest position for someone else to inhabit. This little section is called "How It Feels to Be Silenced Me." You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. That's the Miranda warning, which all U.S. police officers recite to suspects, giving them the opportunity to remain silent. For many people in academia, however, especially those from traditionally subordinated groups, the opportunity to remain silent feels a lot like an admonition to remain silent. Whatever they say in class, at faculty senate, at a department meeting, can and will be used against them, or so they fear. And here's an example of that fear. I feel compelled to provide a specific traumatic event with much at stake materially, academically, or emotionally. But since frequent and quite vulgar attempts to silence me occur on a regular basis, I cannot draw on one specific incident. I am a black male, and silencing, like police harassment, comes with the territory. Besides, to draw on one incident might neutralize the gravity of the phenomenon. My psychological, spiritual, and cultural health and survival depend in part on my ability to deflect the transgressions of singular instances of silencing, overcome them when possible, and ultimately ignore or blunt the emotional and psychological sharpness of their effects. But therein lies the rub. Escaping the shadow of a dominant discourse which allows others to consistently control or contain what blackness and black maleness means inside or outside the classroom seems to be a task of Sisyphean proportions. Of course I intervene. Of course I interrogate. Of course I resist. But much too often, the final word, the final definition, is left in the mouths of others. The relationship of language and silence to deprivation is profound. This academic has not been deprived of language or speech altogether. Rather, he continues to be deprived of the right to speak as the man he is, whenever he deems it appropriate. He wants language use on his own terms, not at the expense of anyone else, but not always at his own expense. Now, such silencings are not restricted to black scholars. White scholars, too, are disciplined into silence, and their silences, as Audre Lorde has warned, did not always protect them. I've cut out a couple examples. Just as the feminist rhetorical project simultaneously resists and transforms the rhetorical tradition, so does the study of silence and silencing. When the delivery of silence is considered a strategic choice, it resonates with meaning and intention, just like that of the spoken word, whether spoken by the powerful or the weak. Considering productive silence as a rhetorical art can transform rhetorical theory. Reconsidering the role of identity in rhetorical studies might do so as well. Part 5, Identities as Epistemic Resources. And I like this quote especially. With whom do you believe your lot is cast? From where does your strength come? I think somehow, somewhere, every poem of mine must repeat those questions which are not the same. Whenever I return to the variables of any rhetorical equation, who can speak, who can listen, who will be listened to, and what those listeners might do, I'm troubled by the variable of whom will be listened to. We live in a world of spectacularly rich and diverse rhetorical display, yet our field remains distressingly impoverished because those most listened to, recorded, written about, and discussed are still the powerful, the recognized, the readily accessible. Thus, in many ways, despite, or maybe because of, our academic efforts, we're still living in a rhetorically sequestered world. Given the overall feminist objective of my research agenda, to make rhetorical studies more representative and inclusive of all people who use rhetoric ethically and effectively, I now find myself evaluating the possibilities of linking identity formation, construction, representation with rhetorical studies. Now, I realize when I invoke identity studies, I'm not talking about anything new. Literary studies, sociology, religion, critical theory, sex and gender studies, even philosophy, more about that, are just a few of the academic discourses that have already worked with, if not moved beyond, identity studies. But just as rhetoric was one of the last academic fields to face the challenges of feminism, even after philosophy, long a masculinist enterprise, had done so, it seems to be one of the last fields to leverage a connection with identity studies. In order to explore this issue, I've begun preliminary research on a book-length project tentatively entitled How the Marmons Became Indian, which was inspired by family stories. Robert G. Marmon, 1848, and his older brother Walter G. Marmon, 1845, were born in Logan County, Ohio. After serving in the Union Army during the Civil War, Walter made his way out west as a government surveyor. In 1869, he surveyed both the 37th parallel boundary of New Mexico and the newly proclaimed Navajo Indian Reservation. In 1870, he made a preliminary survey for an Atlantic and Pacific railway route from Albuquerque, I've never said that out loud, I won't again, to the Arizona line. On that job, Walter became acquainted with Laguna Pueblo and decided to settle there for a while to serve as their school teacher. Within 3 years, his brother Robert, known as R.G., joined him there by way of a series of events akin to a Greek Odyssey. R.G. too became a teacher, substituting for Walter, who was out on a survey trip. He was out in Arizona. During Walter's 3-month absence, R.G. learned to, and this is the term, speak Indian. He learned Karisan better than Walter had. Now, both brothers married Laguna girls, and that's a quote, and spent their lives on the Pueblo, taking leadership roles in education, commerce, and government. In fact, Walter was Laguna's first white governor. They were also very involved in education. Now, what interests me about the Marmon story, besides a family connection, is how relatively quickly these men renegotiated their identities. They could not change their physical appearance, but they could change their sense of group membership. They became so identified with Laguna that their white contemporaries referred to them as squaw men. In other words, they were neither fixed nor segregated by their white identity. Rather, they actively recreated their identity through their words and actions. The first generation of Ohio Laguna children considered themselves Indian, as has every Mormon out west ever since. Even though others have too often accused them of being mixed or worse, they still claim an identity as Indian. Those of you familiar with Leslie Marmon Silko's Storyteller might remember the story of R.G. taking his 2 sons to Albuquerque. One of those boys grew up to become Silko's Grandpa Hank. Here's what Silko writes. Grandpa Hank and his brother Kenneth were just little boys when my great-grandfather took them on one of his trips to Albuquerque. The boys got hungry, so great-grandfather started to take them to the lobby of the only hotel in Albuquerque at that time. Grandpa Hank said that when the hotel manager spotted him and Kenneth, the manager stopped them. He told Grandpa Marmon that he was always welcome when he was alone, but when he had Indians with he should use the back entrance to reach the cafe. My great-grandfather said, "These are my sons." He walked out of the hotel and never would set foot in that hotel again, not even years later when they began to allow Indians inside. So what might this story have to do with rhetorical studies? Well, it demonstrates the argument of many scholars that identity is created in the presence of complex others, and largely through speech. But it also points to the way identity is spoken through skin, as Nina Jablonski confirms in the opening lines of her fabulous new book called Skin. Have you seen it? She's one of my colleagues in anthropology. She was on the Colbert Report. It was great. Just great. She writes, "Our skin mediates the most important transactions of our lives. Skin is key to our biology, our sensory experiences, our information gathering, and our relationship with others. And it's that relationship with others that most interests me." Now, Paula Moya tells us that the texts and lived experiences of marginalized people are rich sources of frequently overlooked information about our shared world. And Satya Mohanty writes that identities are ways of making sense of our experiences, enabling us to read the world in specific ways, ways we should be sharing with one another. After all, with any assumption, assignment, and experience of identity comes both relations with and separations from others. Rhetorical studies is a case in point. So I wonder, what might our field gain by recognizing all identities as epistemic resources that could be mobilized for their knowledge-generating potentials? What are the possibilities for rhetorical histories, theories, practices, and pedagogies when we consider the politics and reality of identities? These questions represent a third possibility at the intersection of rhetoric and feminism. Part 6. Toward a transformed inclusionary rhetoric. We don't want to leave it to a handful of specialists. Rhetoricians Sonia Foss and Cindy Griffin argue that many people, especially those from subordinated groups, have trouble understanding traditional rhetoric because of its inherent bias toward persuasion as power over. To demonstrate their point, they juxtapose the rhetorical theory of feminist writer Starhawk. Do you know her? With that of one of the most influential rhetoricians of our time, Kenneth Burke. It's just great. It's great what they do. Using a method they refer to as resourcement, Foss and Griffin place these different rhetorics alongside each other, not exactly as Burke does with his perspective by incongruity, but rather as reflection and negotiation. Thus, the authors offer Starhawk's rhetoric of inherent worth, power with, and empowered action in dialectical tension with Burke's theories of hierarchy and domination, which have long dominated the discipline of rhetoric. Like Starhawk's rhetorical theories of inherent worth and empowered actions, the rhetorical possibilities I'm offering today, a regard for women's contributions, the power of silence, the force of identity, also resists the discipline of rhetoric. None of those possibilities relies solely on mastery over another. Rather, they require us to consider rhetoric from a completely different point of view. After all, as Moya so succinctly puts it, to the extent that we are interested in gaining a more accurate understanding of our social world, we must give greater weight to socially marginalized identities and non-dominant perspectives. Though not a rhetorician, but she has great rhetorical instincts, Moya intuitively values the power width of collaboration and the inherent worth of non-dominant values and practices. She writes, unless we have access to alternative perspectives, we risk being arrested in the process of our intellectual and moral growth. And I say it's up to folks like us to initiate that growth. Encouraging others to speak out, write up, talk back, while we engage in generative silence and productive listening, these are the ways that stimulate the formulation of new ways of being rhetorical. Rhetors can use language and silence to resist domination and instead invite consideration, as in the case of Foss and Griffin's theory of invitational rhetoric. Invitational rhetoric, which asks that a listener listen, and in response, this is a change, the rhetor listen, both sides taking turns at being productively vocal, vulnerable, and silent, transforms the rhetorical discipline from one of persuasion, control, and discipline on the part of the rhetor to a moment of inherent worth, equality, and empowered action for rhetor and audience alike. As one feature of invitational rhetoric, a rhetorical silence of productive listening can transform the interactional goal of rhetoric from one of persuasion to that of understanding. Another feature could be the rewriting of rhetorical history and theory in order to more ethically and accurately represent the dominant and marginalized alike. Most of all, rhetors using invitational rhetoric will not be participating in the traditional rhetorical discipline of combat and dominance. They will be sharing perceptions, sharing understandings, and sharing power. As you all know well, one of the stubborn facts to which all rhetoricians seem to hold fast is that rhetorical history should do something, that rhetorical inquiry should make a difference in the world. And although agency is a contested term, our field does indeed have agency, the power to take efficacious action. So even if that agency is always contingent, it can be adopted strategically, another echo of Spivak, as well as rigorously, to represent and include more users and uses of rhetoric, particularly those that have long been gendered invisible, silent, and insignificant. By using an interpretive framework that shapes language and identity as mutually nourishing, we can forge new identifications and new affiliations. At the same time, we do what I hope we do, mobilize our rhetorical future. Thank you. I know some of you have to go. I'm so appreciative of your staying. But if you have any questions, I'm glad to answer them now. I don't know what you usually do. Do you just usually start drinking? 'Cause that's fine too.
We usually start at noon.
Oh, okay, all right. But I'm very happy to take questions. Sure. Tell me your name again.
Jennifer Campbell.
Jennifer, yeah.
One of the things that you mentioned toward the end of your presentation was the idea of the rhetoric giving an invitation to voice for others
Yes.
who have been marginalized. But then I was wondering, how do you perceive of the competing responsibilities between yourself or any of us as rhetorical citizens who need to be speaking their own voice, as opposed to your role as a rhetorical scholar or educator giving voice to others? And do you ever see those as a conflict, or do they tend to be more synergistic in your role?
Well, I can't think we give voice to others. So I mean, that was a wonderful misstatement. I mean, I know that you didn't mean it that way, but many people do talk in those terms, giving voice to others. I think that's where that's such a traditional way, and I know you didn't mean it that way, but you've heard it that way so many times. Yeah. I think we have to shut up and let them talk. But if there's a dialogue, then I do get to say what I need to say too, don't I?
And does that tie into your idea of the collaboration and interviewing and some of your other methodological work?
Yes, 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 absolutely. Yes.
In my research on silence economics,
Could you be a little louder? Because I know people back there can't hear you.
when I'm thinking about silence and I'm thinking about embodied rhetorics,
Yes.
whether it's gendered, whether it's skin, whether
Yeah.
it's veganism, right, something that's embodied, I'm trying to process intellectually now how silence works in those situations, right, in terms of you are your rhetoric because you are embodied.
Aren't I great? I just interrupted you. Sorry.
We're on the same page, you know. So,
Well, I gave a 4Cs paper about this a couple years ago, using I don't know what it was. It was really good. You weren't there, were you? Good. So I'll tell you about it. It was really good. No, I talked about using silence as embodied action, and fortunately, I have a friend who's is that woman here who's from Santa Fe? No, she's not here. I have a friend who's a minister in Santa Fe, and I knew this was coming up, Talitha Arnold. I didn't know that March 8th was Women's Peace Day. It's March 8th?
International Women's Day?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. I knew then, 2 years ago, when I was writing this paper. And she was telling me what she was setting up in Santa Fe, and I get the Santa Fe newspaper, so I saw it. There are women all around the world who pose in the shape of a peace symbol, or the word peace, or the word paz, or something like that, all over the world. And an aerial photographer takes their pictures as their bodies, their silent bodies, are in this position. And my favorite is this big, peace sign. Sometimes they just do a sit-in or a kneel-in. Now they're always silent, and the great thing is they're naked, to show the vulnerability of the earth and of our people. And in Santa Fe, they all got in this big piece, they were all lying on their stomachs, and they posed first. It was on a huge field. The aerial photographer said, okay, it's ready. Then they hurried up and took off all their clothes. Then the assistant came and took them all out of the way. And then the photographer took the picture, and then they all got dressed and went home, I guess. But, I mean, that's a kind of embodied activism that's also silent. Is that anything close to what you're thinking of?
It is, and one of the things I'm struggling with now, trying to theorize now, is how does silence
Wait, the nude women are conscious that they're being
Right,
silent.
I'm trying to figure out how it's rhetorical when it's not conscious, right? Like
It might not be rhetorical then. It could be, but you know, I'm thinking of it as being a conscious use of silence, or knowing consciously that you're being silenced. Now, I would love it if, I'm not disagreeing with you, I'm just saying that's all the further I went with it, and maybe you could just take it on home and that would be great.
You're not going to make my life easier?
I mean, it sounds terrific. I think what's so interesting right now are these monks in Thailand. Burma, yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's very, very interesting to me. And a lot of the early social movements included sit-ins and silence, and that was conscious, you know. The only times, I mean, the problem with silence is that the delivery of silence is always the same. And often we don't know what it means, except Perry Gilmore has written this great essay. She wrote this great essay on stylistic sulking. And those of us who have raised teenage girls know about that. You know, it looks like this. So you're probably going further, and I'd be happy to be in contact with you if you'd like.
I'm trying to go further.
I'm sure you will. But it sounds great. I don't know what to say about unconscious unless you're doing an analysis of it, but I don't know if you could ask the people about it. Maybe.
I have.
Oh, good. What do they say? We don't have a clue?
No, what they were trying to figure out, like vegans and vegetarians, that's what my researchers were. They were trying to figure out why they were inherently antagonistic. Why every moment of their life they encountered antagonism. And they couldn't figure it out because they didn't feel like they were projecting anything. If they were saying these were personal decisions, you know, I wasn't enforcing my beliefs on anybody else, but they were still getting antagonism back. And one of the, in talking to sort of people on the other side of that fence, one of the things that I'm arguing is that they're inherently rhetorical because their presence suggests an ethic to eating. Their silence.
Yes, I do think it. I was thinking there's kind of a superiority.
Right. Even if you, in your silence, are trying to deflect that, it's still received. So it's still rhetorical, even if it's not consciously manipulated in that way.
Yeah. Well, you know, I think that will change as we get poisoned more and more by the meat we're eating. And I eat meat too, so. But I think that's going to change. But I can remember being in college, and if you didn't smoke, you were considered kind of morally superior, you know. I think it'll change, but I don't know. I'd love to read more about your work and talk to you about it. Yeah. Tell me your name again.
Blake.
Oh, of course, Blake, Louisiana. Drive-through daiquiris. That's right.
Yes. This builds on what she was saying about silence, and one sort of like I guess additional thing to think about for me anyway is rank.
Yeah.
Sort of differs the rhetoric or distinguishes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Situations where I'm a teacher, and if I really want to bring people to attention, I'll just shut up.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone suddenly wonders, why isn't the teacher saying anything? Now I get quiet, and suddenly I have this power. But conversely, if I'm in a staff meeting with colleagues and I'm quiet, I don't think anything's going to change. And it's totally because of the power that I wield as the person of attention. And I wonder...
It could be if you were speaking too. I mean, if you're speaking to your class, it probably holds, I mean, I would assume it holds more authority than, you know, I don't mean to be offensive, but all of us know that when you leave home, you suddenly know more than what you do when you're in your own campus. So I suppose with your colleagues, they don't care if you talk so much either. I don't know.
Right, exactly.
No offense. No judgment.
No, I think that's true. I'm just curious to get your opinion on what effect you think silence has for those who are already not empowered versus silence by those who in fact are being looked at to speak.
Well, it's the same with, I mean, I really think that when we start paying attention to the way silence is being used, it does have a constellation like the spoken rhetoric. or written rhetoric, and we can look at it this way. As you know well, if there are people who are in cultural ethnic groups or positions that are already subordinated, and I feel superior to them, I don't care if they talk or are silenced. I don't care if that's the kind of person I am. I don't think the silence or the speaking really makes any difference, because, as I've argued, that we have a lot of people using rhetoric very well. The African American church, it wasn't until recently that we really had rhetorics about that. Women in the pulpit, we didn't have rhetorics about that till pretty recently either. I mean, there's been a lot going on that nobody's paid any attention to. So if they're doing really good work that's been ignored, the silences would be too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly the thing I'm worried about.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about situations in which some underrepresented group or some group that would want to be heard would use the rhetoric of silence, and that silence would be overlooked as much as...
I bet. Doug?
But I think when to use the case of Blake, here's how and we could do sort of the check around the room. There are those of us. For those who don't know, about 20 of us spend a couple of hours, a couple of times a week involved in these discussions. I think, like, when you talk, though, people pay attention. So here's what happens: the power of the silence is only realized when you talk, and it's like you accrue it. No, and really, but you know,
yeah.
if you never talked, I suppose that would be like this high level of tension. But you know, and like my perception talks less frequently than certainly me or a lot of other. But it's you know, it's like, you know, potential energy, and then it becomes kinetic energy when you. So I think that's how it works. But yeah, I think your point's well taken. And so it's kind of like, you know, at the risk of being really, you know, oversimplifying. Let's say you had an Indian student in a class who never spoke, and then one day raised her hand and spoke. I think there would be, at that moment, she would have a fair amount of attention and probably rhetorical, you know, the ethos would be so loaded at that. I don't know. I'm just thinking.
Well, it's pretty interesting. I teach an undergraduate course. It's really fun, called Rhetorics of Silence. And it's always packed. Who'd have thought? And I have a rule, and I've taught it twice, and I have a rule that I don't know if it's a good rule, but I'm sticking to it again, that before class can end, everybody has to have spoken once. See, Rebecca's even giggling at that. And I have had young women, I'll say, tell me your name again, Jennifer? Jennifer. I'll say, okay, well, class is almost over. Jennifer, you have anything you want to add? No. Well, you know, everybody has to say something. Okay? And Jennifer's getting really mad at me because she didn't want to say anything. So finally she'll say, well, okay. And then she'll just say something kind of huffy, and I'll say, okay, class is over. And then afterwards, Jennifer will come to me and say, I don't speak in class. I've taught the course twice, and this has happened several times. And I'd say, well, you do now. You only have to say one sentence. You only have to venture one assertion. Ask one question. I don't care. I just want everybody to talk because I don't want people dominating class. Now, at the end, Jennifer in the evaluation will write every time, twice I've taught the class, every time, I'm really glad you made me speak. Now I speak in all my other classes. And the people who usually dominate, I'll say, okay, Blake, now see, you've already spoken once, so let somebody else who hasn't spoken yet, and then I'll be glad to come back to you. So we play that. And what I realized, though, is that the over-talkers, the guys, the first time I taught, I had 21 young women and 5 guys. And the first day, the 5 guys did all the talking. But toward the end, I realized they were still in control. Because then they'd say, you haven't spoken yet. You haven't spoken yet. And while I was doing it, I thought, oh, they're just great. And then I realized they're still controlling the class. So that's one thing I do. And I do it in graduate seminars too. Of course, they're much smaller, but everybody has to talk every day, even if it's just a little bit. I don't know if that's the right thing to do, but I'm doing it till I decide.
I've done that before.
Yeah, you've been in some of my seminars.
Yeah, well, I remember that. I mean, well, I think we talked about it specifically, but I remember that actually. But I've done that in my courses, and I stopped doing it because there was, and it was here actually where I stopped doing it, because I had one student in my class who was an ESL student who practically fell apart
Yeah.
in class. And I just didn't really know how to handle it at the time. And I think until I get my bearings on it, I don't know if I never do it for the whole class, but I'll do it for just one particular class, period.
Well, Jennifer,
Where
one thing.
I asked everyone to speak. Yeah.
One thing I, oh,
Hard
excuse
to
me.
know how to react to that
Yeah.
publicly.
One thing I've done is said, okay, I'm going to take questions in 1 minute. I want everybody to write their question down. And that gives everybody a chance to get their thoughts together, especially when I have students whose English is not their native tongue. And then I try to call on that student early, if I give 1 minute. And when I've spoken and been to conferences in, in other parts of the world, where the conference is being held in English, but most people there are non-native speakers of English, I've noticed that the chairs of sessions always say, to give everybody an opportunity, I'm going to wait 1 minute before, that's where I learned it, before taking questions, so that the blabby Americans weren't the first person to always ask the question.
You had them write it out.
Yeah.
And then you call to read it.
Well, then they volunteer, and then yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. You look familiar. How, do I know you? What's your name?
Funny, so if that reminds you of something.
What's your name?
Frederic.
You look familiar.
But anyway, well, a couple of things. First, I'm a living example of speaking funny and having an accent, and I'm also a language teacher. But I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about something else. I want to talk indeed about. I think it's a different student in the class. We're talking about an ESL student. But I have a student who's absolutely remarkable in a very small seminar, first year seminar, and she speaks very slowly, and she has a way to connect with the topic of our discussion in very personal and emotional ways. In other words, whenever this particular student speaks, I as a teacher, but I'm good at this, so I can take it. We are wasting time. So the whole notion of the waste of time in our traditional way of understanding rhetorics and making use of all that time. But at the same time, I can see the other students. I mean, they're good students. They are really, they have a lot of compassion and they do a great job. We listen. We listen with our hearts instead of listening with our minds. And all of a sudden, we listen for something else, to something else. And I just want to say that it is a very relaxing, and it's another way to learn and to value another rhetoric or sense of rhetoric. And so I just want to thank you for validating my wasting time, Cheryl, in the name of listening to another story. It was so funny because we were discussing The Lover by Marguerite Duras in English, however, and we were talking about, for those of you who know the story, it's the wrong kind of love and all of that good stuff. And we talked about love in the class, and I said, well, there are all kinds of ways of expressing that sort of love, whether it's being recognized by the norms or not. And then the end of class, 3 students gave me a hug because so much was happening in the classroom. So, not that I want, although Bell Hooks talks a lot about love, but I just want to value not exactly wasting time, but listening and hearing something else rather than highly organized and structured discourse. Sit. Oh, no. That's not, but I wanted to share this.
Thank you.
So I think you have given, theoretical validation to all of that, and to all of us who have resisted traditional rhetorics for such a long time, thinking, I'd rather be quiet than open my mouth and stupid. That's the way I was educating myself, but it has changed now. I think it's very interesting to validate that way of being rhetorical. Thank you.
Thank you.
Why don't we Thanks, Cheryl.
You're welcome. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you. Is that the best thing ever? Smart women put it in writing.
You have to look at the pencils have sayings on them too.
Huge.
God. Doug is the best. You are so lucky to have him here. Oh, this is great. Thank you.